Sir, step away from the house. Hands where I can see him.
I'm in my own yard, officer. What's the issue?
Drop the hose. Step back. Now.
Easy. I'm just watering the lawn.
Hands up. Let me see him.
Right here. Name's Marcus Hill. Gunnery Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, retired. This is my home.
The handcuffs locked around his wrists with a metallic snap. And in that instant, Officer Miller had no idea his career was over. The man in the tan t-shirt standing on the driveway of 1247 Oakwood wasn't panicking. He wasn't arguing. He was simply watching with the unnerving stillness of someone who'd been in far more dangerous situations than this. Someone who knew beyond any doubt that this officer had just stepped on a landmine he couldn't see. The body cam was running. Every command, every assumption, every moment was being captured in high definition. This footage would eventually make its way to desks that Miller didn't even know existed. Desks where people with stars on their shoulders and security clearances would watch what happened next. Officer Miller had been patrolling these streets for 8 years. He wasn't green anymore, but he developed a reputation, the kind of cop who trusted his gut more than he trusted the facts. That afternoon, dispatch crackled through his radio about a vehicle theft 2 blocks over. The description was almost useless. A suspicious person seen near the area, newer to the neighborhood. That was all. No vehicle description, no suspect details, no actual evidence. Just a neighbor's paranoia turned into a police call. Miller cruised through the tree-lined streets, eyes moving from house to house, person to person. He watched a teenager washing a car in a driveway. He slowed past a man unloading boxes from a moving truck. He studied a woman checking her mailbox. None of them had done anything wrong, but Miller was hunting, convinced his instincts would point him to someone who didn't belong. Then he spotted Gary Sargent. Gary was standing in his own front yard, dressed simply in a tan t-shirt and dark pants. In his hands, a garden hose. Water arced through the bright summer air, catching the sunlight as it fell across the lawn he'd barely had time to enjoy since coming home. The scene was perfectly ordinary, perfectly peaceful. A man watering his grass on a quiet Saturday afternoon, trying to carve out a few hours of normalcy after months of hell overseas that Miller would never comprehend. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 10,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these stories matter. Please subscribe to Voiceless Body Cam Files, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. Gary Sargent had been home for exactly 11 days. 11 days since his boots touched American soil. 11 days since he traded the suffocating heat of classified operations for the simple pleasure of mowing his own lawn. For most people, that's just another weekend chore. For Gary, it was a luxury that felt almost foreign. Marine Raiders exist in a space most Americans will never see. They're not the troops you see in recruitment commercials. They're the ones who operate in the shadows, the Tier 1 operators who get called when conventional forces can't get the job done. Officially, they're known as Marine Special Operations Command, MARSOC. In practice, they're the scalpel the military uses when a hammer won't work. Gary had spent the last 8 months in places that don't appear on mission briefings, doing things that would never make it into official reports. The transition from combat operations to suburban normalcy isn't a switch you flip. It's a slow decompression. While his neighbors worried about property taxes and homeowner association rules, Gary's nervous system was still calibrated for threats that don't exist in quiet neighborhoods. The sound of a car backfiring could spike his heart rate. A shadow moving too quickly in his peripheral vision could trigger responses trained into him through thousands of hours of close-quarters combat drills. His wife, Monica, understood this better than most. She'd watched him come home from 4 deployments, each one leaving invisible marks that took months to fade. She knew that the man watering the lawn wasn't fully present yet. Part of him was still scanning roof lines, still calculating exit routes, still running threat assessments on every person who walked past their house. That's why the garden hose mattered so much. It was therapy disguised as yard work. The simple, repetitive motion of watering plants was grounding. It reminded his brain that he was home, that the mission was over, that he could lower his guard just enough to breathe normally again. Monica had suggested it gently, and Gary had embraced it. Every morning, before the heat became unbearable, he'd stand in the front yard with that hose, watching water arc across the grass, feeling a little more human with each passing minute. He had no idea that this morning's meditation would be interrupted by someone who didn't recognize peace when he saw it. Officer Dan Miller had a philosophy about policing that he'd share with anyone who'd listen. "Trust your gut," he'd say, usually while leaning against his patrol car with his arms crossed. "The academy teaches you procedures, but the street teaches you instincts." It was a convenient philosophy for someone who didn't like being questioned. Miller had joined the force 9 years ago with genuine intentions. He wanted to make a difference to protect his community. But somewhere along the way, those intentions had curdled into something else. He'd started seeing patterns that didn't exist, connecting dots that had no connection. In his mind, he wasn't profiling, he was being proactive. He called it predictive policing, though that term usually refers to data-driven approaches, not personal biases dressed up as intuition. His sergeants had noticed. There'd been complaints, 3 formal ones in the past 2 years. Citizens claiming they'd been stopped for driving while black or walking while suspicious. Each time, Miller had an explanation ready. Each time, the department had given him the benefit of the doubt. After all, he hadn't done anything explicitly illegal. He was just aggressive, just thorough, just doing his job the way he understood it. The problem with gut feelings in law enforcement is that they're often just prejudices with a badge. Studies have shown that implicit bias affects even well-intentioned officers. When you're looking for crime in specific communities, you'll find it, not because those communities are inherently more criminal, but because you're paying more attention there. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy that destroys trust and ruins lives. Miller's partner, Officer Sarah Chen, had tried talking to him about it once. She pointed out that their arrest patterns didn't match the actual crime distribution in their district. Miller had brushed her off, accused her of being too soft, too concerned with politics instead of policing. After that, Chen had stopped riding with him when she could avoid it. On this particular morning, Miller was alone in his patrol car, exactly the way he preferred it. No one to second-guess his decisions. No one to suggest he might be wrong. Just him, his instincts, and a radio call that was about to give him the excuse he'd been waiting for. The dispatch came through at 10:47 a.m. "All units, we have a report of a vehicle theft, corner of Oakwood and Elm. Caller reports seeing an unfamiliar individual in the area approximately 30 minutes ago. No vehicle description available. No suspect description beyond someone new to the neighborhood." Caller states they felt something was off. Miller's hand was on his radio before the dispatcher finished. "Unit 12 responding. I'm 2 minutes from that location." Chen's voice crackled through. "Unit 8, I'm closer coming from Maple. I can take it." "Negative, Unit 8, Miller cut in. "I know this neighborhood, I've got it." What he meant was, I know who belongs there and who doesn't. In Miller's mental map of his patrol area, every street had a demographic profile. Oakwood was older homes, mostly white families who'd lived there for decades, with a few younger couples buying up properties as investments. Anyone who didn't fit that narrow profile registered as suspicious to him. The truth about this particular call was revealing. The theft hadn't been confirmed. No one had actually reported a stolen car. A resident had simply seen someone they didn't recognize walking down the street, and in the strange calculus of suburban anxiety, unfamiliar plus uncomfortable feeling equaled probable crime. The dispatcher had elevated it to a theft report because the caller had insisted something was wrong, though they couldn't articulate what. This happens more often than most people realize. According to data from police departments across the country, a significant percentage of calls are based on suspicion rather than actual criminal activity. Someone doesn't look right. Someone is in the wrong neighborhood. Someone is acting often just means existing while not matching the caller's expectations. Miller turned onto Oakwood Street with his windows down, scanning yards and driveways. He was hunting, and he'd already decided he'd know his prey when he saw it. His training had taught him about reasonable suspicion and probable cause, legal standards that are supposed to protect citizens from arbitrary stops. But Miller had learned to reinterpret those standards through the lens of his assumptions. In his mind, being in a wrong place was itself suspicious. Not belonging was itself probable cause. He was 3 houses away when he saw Gary. The contrast was almost cinematic. Gary stood in worn jeans and that tan t-shirt, his posture relaxed but somehow perfectly balanced, the way people stand when their muscles remember training that never fully leaves. The water from his hose traced a lazy arc across the lawn, droplets catching sunlight like tiny prisms. Behind him, the house was modest but well kept, with flowers Monica had planted in the beds flanking the front steps. Miller's patrol car rolled to a stop at the curb, and the energy shifted immediately. Gary noticed, of course he noticed. You don't survive multiple deployments in hostile territory without developing a sixth sense for when someone's attention locks onto you. He didn't stop watering, didn't change his posture, but his awareness sharpened. His brain began automatically cataloging details: vehicle position, officer's body language, potential exits, sight lines. Miller stepped out of his cruiser with the kind of swagger that suggests authority but reads as aggression. His hand rested on his duty belt near his weapon, a posture meant to project control. In law enforcement training, officers learn about tactical positioning and officer safety. These are legitimate concepts. Approaching unknown situations with caution makes sense. But there's a difference between cautious awareness and theatrical dominance, and Miller had never learned where that line was. "Morning," Miller called out, his tone already accusatory despite the friendly word. "You live here." Gary turned slowly, the hose still in his hand. His face showed nothing. No anger, no fear, no surprise. Just the flat, professional calm of someone who'd been in actual firefights and knew this wasn't one. "Yes, officer. Can I help you?" That calm infuriated Miller, though he couldn't have explained why. He expected deference, maybe nervousness. Instead, he was looking at a man who seemed completely unimpressed by the badge and the gun and the authority Miller wielded like a weapon. What Miller didn't recognize, what he couldn't recognize, was the specific quality of Gary's stillness. This wasn't the frozen panic of someone caught doing something wrong. This was the controlled readiness of someone trained to remain functional under stress that would break most people. "I'm going to need to see some identification," Miller said, moving closer, his hand still near his weapon. Gary's response was textbook perfect, the kind of calm de-escalation that trainers teach but rarely see executed this well. "Of course. My ID is inside the house. I'm happy to get it for you. Can I ask what this is about?" It was a reasonable question. In fact, it was exactly what civil rights attorneys tell citizens to ask. Under the Fourth Amendment, police need reasonable suspicion to detain someone. They need probable cause to arrest. Simply being in a public space or your own yard isn't grounds for either. The Supreme Court established in Terry v. Ohio that officers can conduct brief investigative stops based on reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. But I don't recognize this person, doesn't meet that legal threshold. Miller either didn't know this or didn't care. "We had a report of suspicious activity in the area. I need to verify who you are and what you're doing here." "I'm watering my lawn," Gary said, his tone still neutral. "At my residence. I've lived here for 3 years. My ID is inside. Would you like me to go get it?" "Don't move." Miller's hand shifted closer to his weapon. "How do I know you live here? How do I know you're not the one we're looking for?" This is where the encounter crossed a line that would later be dissected by attorneys and review boards. Miller had no description of any suspect. He had no evidence of any crime. He had a homeowner standing in his own yard, engaged in a completely legal activity, who had politely offered to provide identification. The reasonable response would have been to allow Gary to retrieve his ID, perhaps accompanying him to the door. Instead, Miller was escalating. Gary recognized what was happening. He'd seen it before, though never directed at him quite this blatantly. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I haven't committed any crime. I'm standing in my own yard. My wife is inside. My identification, my military ID, my vehicle registration, everything you need to verify who I am is inside that house. I'm willing to cooperate fully, but you need to tell me what legal basis you have for detaining me." The words military ID should have registered. They didn't. Miller heard challenging my authority and his ego took over. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "On what grounds?" Gary's voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath now. "I said turn around." Miller's hand was on his handcuffs now, his face flushed. "You're being detained for investigation." Gary didn't move immediately, and that split-second pause was calculated. He was giving Miller one last chance to recognize the mistake he was making. "Officer, I'm going to comply, but I'm telling you clearly. I am a United States Marine, currently on active duty, and you are violating my Fourth Amendment rights. I have done nothing illegal. I have committed no crime. I am standing in my own yard." Miller's response was to grab Gary's shoulder and spin him around. It was the kind of move that works on people who aren't trained. Gary's body responded instinctively, not with resistance, but with the kind of perfect balance that comes from thousands of hours of combatives training. He didn't fight back, but he didn't go down either. He simply maintained his center of gravity, which made Miller use more force than he'd expected to need. The handcuffs went on. The metal bit into Gary's wrists, tighter than necessary. Miller was breathing hard now, adrenaline spiking from the physical contact. Gary's breathing hadn't changed at all. He was processing the situation tactically, already thinking 3 steps ahead. "You're making a mistake you can't undo," Gary said quietly. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty, not a threat, a fact. "My command is going to want to know why one of their operators was arrested at his own residence without probable cause. You should think very carefully about what happens next." Miller heard operator but didn't understand its significance. In military terminology, that word carries weight. It doesn't just mean soldier. It specifically refers to special operations personnel, SEALs, Rangers, Delta Force, Marine Raiders. These aren't conventional troops. They're highly trained specialists with security clearances that require extensive vetting. They're federal assets, and the military protects its assets aggressively. "Save the tough guy act," Miller sneered. "You can explain everything downtown." He was walking Gary toward the patrol car when the neighbor's front door burst open. Thomas Henderson was 72 years old, a retired Army colonel who'd spent 30 years in service before settling into the quiet house next door to Gary. He'd recognized something in Gary the day the younger man moved in, the way he carried himself, the way his eyes never stopped moving, the courteous but distant demeanor. Henderson had introduced himself, mentioned his own service, and Gary had opened up slightly. They'd had coffee a few times. Henderson knew exactly who lived next door. "Officer, officer." Henderson was moving faster than a man his age should, crossing his lawn in long strides. "What the hell are you doing?" Miller turned, annoyed at the interruption. "Sir, step back. This doesn't concern you." "That man is a Marine Raider. He lives in that house. He's a decorated service member, and you're arresting him for watering his own damn lawn." The words hit the air like a flashbang. Miller's partner, Chen, had arrived as backup and was just stepping out of her vehicle. Her head snapped up at Marine Raider. Her hand moved instinctively to her radio. Miller scoffed. "Sir, I don't care if he says he's the president. He's being detained for investigation." But Henderson wasn't backing down. "I'm not asking, officer. I'm a retired colonel, and I'm telling you that man has a security clearance higher than your chief's. His commanding officer is going to want to know why you violated federal law by detaining a military operator without cause. Chen was already pulling up the address on her mobile data terminal. Standard procedure requires running addresses and names through multiple databases before making arrests. Miller had skipped this step, too eager to prove his instincts right. Now Chen's screen was populating with information that made her blood run cold. "Miller," she called out, her voice tight. "Miller, you need to see this." He ignored her, focused on getting Gary into the back of his cruiser. "We'll sort this out at the station." "Miller," Chen's voice cracked like a whip. She was holding up her MDT screen, her face pale. "The address is flagged. Federal protection status. This residence is registered to Gunnery Sergeant Gary Sargent, United States Marine Corps Special Operations Command. There's a notification protocol. We're supposed to contact his command immediately if there's any law enforcement interaction." The word "immediately" echoed in the sudden silence. The drive to the station took 12 minutes. Gary sat in the back of the patrol car, silent, his hands still cuffed behind him. Miller drove with his jaw clenched, Chen following in her vehicle. Neither officer spoke. The only sound was the radio crackling with routine traffic and the hum of the engine. In law enforcement, there are certain names and designations that trigger specific protocols. Diplomats with immunity, federal judges, undercover agents, and military personnel with certain clearance levels. These protocols exist for good reasons. They protect sensitive operations, maintain jurisdictional boundaries, and prevent catastrophic mistakes. Miller had ignored all of them. When they pulled into the station's garage, the booking sergeant looked up from his paperwork and did a double take. He recognized Gary, not personally, but from the quarterly briefings about protected individuals in their jurisdiction. "Miller, what the hell is this?" "Suspicious person investigation," Miller said, already defensive. "Possible connection to a vehicle theft." The sergeant was already on his phone. "Get him out of those cuffs, now." "He hasn't been processed yet." "I said now." The sergeant's voice carried enough authority to cut through Miller's ego. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Chen unlocked the handcuffs. Gary rubbed his wrists calmly, still saying nothing. His silence was more damning than any complaint would have been. He was letting the system reveal its own failures. Within minutes, the station's command center became chaos. The watch commander arrived, then the captain. Phone calls were made to the Marine Corps liaison, to the city's legal department, to the mayor's office. Each call added another layer of panic to the situation. Captain Williams entered the room where Gary sat, now uncuffed. With a bottle of water someone had nervously offered him. Williams was a 30-year veteran who'd seen plenty of officer mistakes, but this one made his stomach drop. "Gunnery Sargent, I apologize for this situation. We're investigating what happened." Gary's response was measured. "Captain, I was arrested at my own residence while engaging in illegal activity. I identified myself as military. I offered to provide identification. Officer Miller proceeded anyway without probable cause, without reasonable suspicion, and without running basic checks that would have flagged my address. I remained compliant throughout because I understand the system. But I need you to understand something. My command will require a full explanation." The investigation moved with brutal efficiency. The body camera footage was reviewed by multiple levels of command, then by the city's legal team, then by federal authorities when Gary's commanding officer made the required notification to the Inspector General's office. Every frame documented the systematic violation of Gary's rights. Miller was placed on administrative leave within hours. The department's statement was carefully worded, but the message was clear. This had been a catastrophic failure of judgment. The review board found multiple violations: unlawful detention, failure to establish reasonable suspicion, use of excessive force during the arrest, and failure to follow protocols for protected individuals. But the real consequences went deeper than disciplinary action. The incident triggered a broader investigation into Miller's arrest patterns. Data analysts examined his stops over the previous 3 years and found exactly what Officer Chen had noticed: a clear pattern of racial profiling. His gut feelings had consistently targeted Black and Hispanic residents at rates that couldn't be explained by crime statistics. The Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice opened their own inquiry. The city settled with Gary for an undisclosed amount rather than face a federal lawsuit that would have exposed systemic problems in their department. Miller was terminated, his certification revoked. 3 weeks after the arrest, Gary was back in his front yard with the garden hose. The incident had made local news, though Gary had declined all interview requests. He didn't want to be a symbol or a headline. He just wanted what he'd wanted all along: peace. Henderson came over that morning with coffee, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the water arc across the grass. "You handled that well," the old colonel said. Gary shrugged. "Training. Stay calm, document everything, let them make the mistakes." He paused. "I've faced actual enemies overseas, Colonel. That officer wasn't an enemy. He was just a man who let fear and bias override his judgment. The sad part is he probably thought he was doing the right thing." The incident became a training case study at police academies across the state. It illustrated everything that can go wrong when officers rely on assumptions instead of evidence, when they see certain neighborhoods or certain people as inherently suspicious. It showed how quickly a routine encounter can become a career-ending mistake when basic protocols are ignored. Gary's lawn eventually grew in thick and green. He still waters it most mornings, though neighbors now wave and call out greetings. The house became a symbol in the community, not of injustice, but of resilience and the importance of accountability. And somewhere in a training room, new officers watch the body camera footage and learn what happens when you forget that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of what your gut tells you.